Emma's speech in regards to gun control. And Emma had a few points. Her main thing that I'm responding to is an increase in gun control laws would decrease the number of mass shootings. And more specifically, she has on her proposition that she meant by that, it is necessary to implement stronger background checks and outlaw certain guns. She has 4 claims listed. First being accessing guns is too easy. Second, gun control in other countries have eliminated the occurrence of mass shootings. Third, implementing stronger background checks would decrease the probability of mass shootings happening. 4, outlawing certain assault weapons would prevent mass shootings. So we're going to look at the first claim that she has. Accessing guns is too easy, and it is a fact that in states like Florida and Virginia and Nevada, they are the easiest states that you can go into a store and get a gun. We have one owner, John Markle. He's the owner of the Roanoke Firearms Shop. He did a quote in an interview saying that you can go in and get a semi-automatic in 15 minutes. So that is something that is there, though, however, most of the other states do have some form of a process that you have to go through. Out of 8 states, they do, including California, we do have a waiting period. And she mentioned specifically Florida, so I do want to look at that. Florida doesn't have a waiting period or fingerprint. However, earlier this month, after the mass shooting there in the schools, they did, Governor Rick Scott did sign a bill, 7026, which is a gun control legislation. There's a few things that added, but to stick with what she had here in her initial argument, they did raise the age limit from 18 to 21, and there is a mandatory waiting period at this time. Like I said, there are other things that are attached to it. And we have to keep in mind when we're looking at the laws, gun control is a state-to-state thing. It's not a federal thing that you have one law and then everyone has to abide by it. So in that sense, yes, it is easy in certain states, but it's also difficult for everybody to be on the same page because it's state legislated. Okay? And with that, since we did talk about the school, I did want to point out that there are many laws, and there's an article posted on The Guardian, and these are just a few places, again, that I listed here, but there are others. There are laws in certain states, and most states, that does prevent guns from being taken into places where there's mass gatherings, such as colleges, places of worship, hospitals, etc. We also have a quote from David Lampo, director of Cato Institute, that says there is no correlation between the waiting period and robbery and murder rates. So that's saying just having them wait, whether it's a few days, a week, a month, doesn't necessarily state that there will be no incident of a mass shooting. Her second claim is gun control in other countries have eliminated the occurrence of mass shootings. That argument in itself is an invalid statement. There is an article, Mass Shootings, How the U.S. Gun Culture Compares to the Rest of the World. That was done in the Washington Post. And actually that pulls up a chart. And there's mass shootings everywhere. There's not as much as the incidents that we have here, but they exist everywhere. So the statement itself is an invalid argument. One thing I would like to point out that's also in that article by the Washington Post is 2011 at a Norwegian summer camp. There was a mass shooting that left 69 dead, which is actually more deadlier than the Las Vegas shooting we had recently. We also see the advocate used a site for most of her claims to support it, procon.org, and in that very same article, it actually points out that Mexico has some of the strongest gun laws, and in 2013 alone had 11,309 gun-related murders as compared to that of the U.S. at the same time of 9,146. In that same article, we have a quote by researcher Jacqueline Schickalt, hope I pronounced that right, that said even when we're looking in comparison to the U.S., from the U.S. to other countries, it's actually hard to compare the statistics because they have a tendency of labeling these mass shootings as terrorist attacks versus we don't necessarily label them ones as, done by a U.S. citizen on our soil. We don't label these terrorist attacks, so it's hard to differentiate. Third, we have implementing stronger background checks would decrease the probability of mass shootings happening. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, well, she did mention in her proposition that there's a lot of self-reporting happening. Again, back to procon.org. As I mentioned, sorry to repeat it again, that the requirements do differ, but in recent mass shootings done by those had no previous background checks. So in doing the background checks, it comes up clear, they're going to get the permit. These are the people who, not saying everyone, but these are in more recent times the ones who are doing it. Even if they would have ran a background check, it would have come up clear, they would have received the weapons anyway. Okay, so it's not going to prevent that. Also, I have listed here 62 of the mass shootings in the US. 49 in most recent times since 1982, 49 of those shooters actually obtained their weapons legally. And next, she mentioned mental health. I have that as a common misconception. We have doctors and mental health advocates that says it's little providing direct connection between actual mental health and mass shooting. That's actually was done on National Public Radio, NPR. And there's analysis done of the 235 mass shootings showed that actually only 22% would have been considered mentally ill, and that was done by the New York Times. American Psychiatric Association, also to that matter, says that only 1% of gun homicides actually accounts by someone with a mental illness. And lastly, outline assault weapons would prevent mass shootings. 2 studies that I have listed here, both from procon.org. First study was in 2013. Assault rifles did not, which was banned between 1990 and 2009, didn't significantly reduce murder rates happening. And states with high gun-related murders shows that they actually have higher gun restrictions. So in conclusion, though I think we can all agree that there is an epidemic happening here that somehow needs to be taken care of, what the advocate provided and the supporting claims does not make support that making the changes of what she has here, increasing stronger background checks and outlawing certain guns. There's no proof that those will actually decrease mass shooting if that's happening.
What was the time? 7. 30 seconds. Okay. Okay, well, you summarized the advocate's claim pretty clearly and you previewed what the secondary points are. On your individual points, when you get to each of those, you don't always have a declarative sentence telling us what your position is or what the claim is that you're going to be making there. On the first point, you basically concede the advocate's point that in some states you can get a gun pretty effectively and quickly without having to wait very long. That's reasonable to accept if you believe that that is true. One of the things, though, that I think you might want to look at is their analysis. Did any of the shootings that took place, for example, the Parkland shooting that is our most recent horrifying example of this, did the shooter get their gun and then walk over to the school and commit the crime? In other words, if they had bought the gun 6 months earlier, 10 months earlier, 2 years earlier, would it be any less horrific? The idea that a waiting period makes a difference. You make an argument about that later on, but these are the particular cases that are being cited here. So I think maybe you need to kind of come to grips with those things, particulars, as the argument develops. The notion that it is a state issue is okay. we're not really discussing here whether or not it will be done or should be done. Those are policy considerations. The bigger question is, would it make a difference? And the comparison between states that have waiting times and those that don't have waiting times, you did have one piece of evidence that suggested that there seemed to be no correlation between wait times and murders, and I thought that that was the best piece of information on that particular point, and it's the one that most directly makes a claim about what the advocate's position is. On the comparison to other countries, you do suggest that there are mass shootings in all around the world. I thought that was pretty good. I have seen some data that suggests that the frequency or the number of people who are killed in mass shootings around the world is different, and the United States maybe does not stand out particularly. You don't have that particular data, but you do have one comparison where you make to the Norwegian experience, where they had a horrific set of murders where 69 people were killed, and you say, that's in Norway. I don't know what their gun laws are like. That might have been something that could have been introduced as well. I did think the comparison to Mexico, which has very strict gun laws, to the United States was important. The number of murders that they have relative to us, I thought that was a good comparison to make. You might also point out that Mexico's population is substantially smaller than the United States, so that murder rate seems more substantially important as a consequence, and I think that would make your argument a little bit stronger. Once again, I think you need to contrast that to the evidence that the advocate presented on these particular points. What information did they use to cite on this particular point, and maybe do a little bit more comparison here. I don't remember what their evidence was. You don't make a specific reference to it, except the procon.org site comes up a couple of times. By the way, sites like that, you're going to see like Debatopedia at procon.org and a lot of sites like that. Those are aggregate sites where they are basically summarizing information and telling you what arguments are on each side without necessarily being a source that you should go to. It's sort of like going to an encyclopedia for information, and it's usually best if you go to the original sources that are cited on those sites rather than quoting the aggregation sites. No problem here in this particular situation. That's not a demerit or an issue here. But when we do the debates, for instance, that's going to come up a lot because people will do research. Those sites come up, and they'll have all kinds of arguments listed for an issue that you're talking about, and they just tell you what the arguments are. But you're not, when you quote those sites, you're not really quoting an expert who's offering an opinion on a site. You're quoting a site that says, well, here's what some potential arguments are. That doesn't necessarily make them good arguments. So you want to be a little bit careful about that. Let's see. The idea that stronger checks also are unlikely to make a difference. I think this is another one of those ones where I think you've got a good piece of information that says 49 out of the 62 mass shootings, the shooters obtained their guns legally. So the only question is whether or not forget the background checks. That doesn't seem to have much effect. You've got the mental illness argument that you're also making here. But remember, the advocate had a different argument as well, which was a ban on assault weapons would have an effect on that. And I'm not sure you actually confront that argument in some of the supporting points here. All right, and a little overtime, but that happens. And we've got time today. Thank you.